Yeah, let's do it. In the round of 16 for the first open qualifiers for the North American VCT, XSET pulled out the win over TSM to knock them out of contention for the closed qualifier. The conclusion of this three-map banger ended on Split, where Wedid pulled out a Viper, an agent pretty seldom used at higher level pro play. I want to take a look at what Wedid did on a round-to-round basis, so let's take a look. So round 1 isn't exactly too crazy or Viper exclusive. Wedid's goal here is to simply act as a body or as a trade during contact play through mid into ropes. He dies early to a set piece from TSM, and yeah, that's about it. Not much to say here. In round number 2, Wedid uses his snakebite into B main right as the round begins in order to discourage TSM from pushing through, and then he walks to join the rest of his team at mid, where they run a similar strat to pistol, only they walk into heaven this time and get completely demolished by Wardell. Although this round isn't too exciting from a Viper utility standpoint, that early snakebite that I mentioned before is going to be a trend that you're seeing for the entirety of this half. Round 3 is where things get a little bit more exciting and you start seeing some more Viper exclusive play. To start, Wedid sets up the meta screen to block off B Heaven, a poison orb that also blocks the B Heaven angle, and then that early snakebite from the last round that I mentioned into B main to discourage aggression. At the same time this is going on, the rest of his team over towards A initiates a flash and dash towards ramps. But, unfortunately for them, Pura goes down almost immediately. In response to this, Wedid grabs a spike and joins the rest of his team towards A main, hoping to get a couple of favorable trades. Although TSM do a pretty good job at holding on to A main control, investing a Blade Storm and doing a couple of flashes through, XR are able to get things back into a bit more of an even state, a 3 versus 2, after some pretty confident trades. So, off the back of this, Wedid is going to lead the charge towards A Heaven, and he's really banking on the fact here that no one is going to be present from TSM after those trades. He pops his Poison Orb from earlier to try to help sell a potential push B, although there's no one present from TSM to relay that info, so it doesn't actually end up doing too much. But he's still being really intricate with his angle clearing and actually ends up winning another fight against Sabrosa towards defender spawn. Shortly after this, BCJ wins another fight with a sight anchor, Cutler, which puts things now into a 2 versus 1 in XSET's favor. Wedid jumps down to plant the spike while BCJ stays in heaven, and he moves over towards Sign. It's kinda hard to crossfire from this position, so BCJ looks to get info and dies due to some pretty unlucky timing. However, with this info relayed, Wedid plays safe behind Sign, listens for the drop and for footsteps, and then peeks with some pretty amazing timing in order to catch off Haze and secure a 4 versus 2 win. Round number 4 is a different approach from XSET, but a pretty similar start for Wedid. He does the same B Heaven screen, Poison Orb, and Snakebite utility setup from last round, but this time he actually has some friends to keep him company. While his friends work to take B main control, Wedid falls back to Ramen and sets up a crossfire with Purar and helps establish control of mid. Now that XSET have this really important map control in their favor, Thwifo and Wedid decide to swap positions and Aaron comes to help out mid from A. Now it's for exactly what you all have been waiting for, the Viper-based execute. It starts with Wedid popping that toxic screen as his teammates are flashing into B Heaven. This really forces TSM to fall back or kind of die for the cause. Now, while this is going on, BCJ and Wedid are on the edge of the B main smoke that Sabrosa tossed out, and they peek with some pretty good timing to find 2 kills in their favor. But the round isn't secure yet. Wedid realizes this, and to try to make it as winnable as possible, pops his ult, that Viper Spit, and takes some fights because his teammates from mid are now on site and ready to crossfire. Despite all this good news, it goes south when TSM kill the spike planter, and Wedid is forced to give up on the crossfire and plant instead. On this tiny advantage, TSM win out their gunfights and take the round. For round number 5, it's the same screen and the same snakebite. However, there's no poison orb that he tosses out at the beginning. At this point, Wedid has done the same approach for a while now, and suddenly stopping these 2 pieces of utility would set off alarm bells in the heads of TSM. The Poison Orb is a bit of an exception since it has been so seldom used this entire game so far and basically not picked up on yet. XSET are looking now to execute A, and they do a pretty good job at cutting noise up until now, and you can see how TSM haven't even budged their rotations at all. XSET, however, eventually gets spotted out, and the rotations and gunfights immediately begin. It's a bit hard to tell what Wedid is trying to do here since he just gets smacked down instantly, and the round falls apart soon after. For round number 6, it's the same screen and the same snakebite out. This round is actually kind of neat though, because Wardell actually gets pressured and punished a bit by that snakebite when he's trying to extend for B main early. It's no kill, but it's good pressure, and TSM as a whole are forced to concede it. This round is similar in structure to what XSET tried earlier with their full B execute, only Aaron is in place of Thwifo in order to grab that orb. They screen up, which cues their mid players to extend for control, and Wedid take some pretty scary fights to keep his boy alive and ends up dying for the cause. All in all, for this round, it looks like XSET were really hoping that Aaron would grab the orb and get out the pop lockdown. It was a bit of a Hail Mary, but the fights didn't go their way. In round number 7, XSET are on a half bye, so they're looking to change up the pace. Wedid joins the rest of his teammates outside A main and sets up a screen that blocks the A heaven angle. Then, right as the round starts, he pops it and uses a snakebite also at the rafters peak to probably discourage peeking in front of the screen or a potential crossfire. This is actually some pretty insane pressure, and Cutler, who's located in heaven, is forced to concede it entirely and play retake. However, it's not so nice for Drone. He's stuck in sight and is basically on a mission to survive as long as possible. And surprisingly, some sneaky James Bond type of shit later and he's out. After the plant is secured, Wedid, PR, and Thwifo push all the way towards CT spawn in order to try to hang on to this control as much as possible. During this, Wedid sets down another snakebite to once again kind of force TSM into their own spawn and buy as much time as possible. Wedid's role in this round ends, however, when he dies for this cause, taking a fight and hoping to be traded. In round number 8, once again with guns, Wedid returns to his old default, the screen and the snakebite. This round is similar to the ones that we've seen in the early game, with XSET's goal here being to walk up as far as possible through mid and into ropes. No set piece from TSM this time, so it goes a bit more smoothly for XSET. Once 4 XSET players are in ropes safely, Wedid raises his screen to try to help sell a fake. It doesn't necessarily fulfill its purpose since TSM were already pushing for info, but it doesn't matter how good this screen was because XSET had already made their way into A heaven and secured some pretty nice fights. Wedid finds Cutler as he's trying to duck and weave to safety, and then he uses Poison Orb at screens to cover that angle. TSM respect this, rotate heaven, and take some super smart fights to break the crossfires that XSET set up, and TSM end up taking the round. Round number 9 is kind of crazy. To start, Wedid decides to say screw it to the screen over towards B, and instead sets up the one that we saw prior in round number 7 that blocks off A heaven and ramps. Right as the round begins, Wedid lights up his wall and PR dashes quickly into A ramps and tosses a couple of smokes out to try to help him sell a fake. This is a ton more convincing, and TSM are kind of forced to respect it. Hayes immediately moves over to help out at A, and while this is going on, Wedid and BCJ slowly work mid, being careful to cut all noise across the way. After ratting their way to B heaven, they grab a cheeky kill into Sabrosa who's changing angles. And look, trust me, Sabrosa, I've been there. After getting things into 4 versus 5, XSET push their advantage and end up executing into B almost immediately. Despite all this good news, XSET actually don't come out on top of nearly any gunfight and end up losing out the round. In round 10, once again, the screen over Ide is set up and immediately popped upon the round beginning. After, a snakebite to ward away Cutler from peeking A heaven, as seen in round number 7. TSM have to respect this overwhelming utility, and they give up on the site to play retake. Once the spike is planted, Wedid pops Viper's Pit and stays on the opposite side of the site from where the spike was planted. Here, Wedid hops in and out of his ult and plays sound, as well as the near site his ult offers amazingly to snag 4 kills and take the round.
Join him up, follow up the fight. We did. Coming out of the smoke. Beautiful positioning. Inside, we did just an animal in the Viper's Pit. Bringing the game, or the round, right back to a 2 versus 2 situation. Constantly rotating away, getting into a different position so everyone knows exactly where he is. This beautiful headshot. We did it just so good. Tracing the round, find time, doesn't he shoot back? He knows they have the time in their favor. He's gonna peek right out, find word on the head, and we did. The monster, the animal, winning another round for XSET, coming up massive with a quadra kill in the Viper's Pit.
In round number 11, Wedid sets up his screen over towards A, which I guess is his new normal? Either way, he sets it up, then runs over to B main to toss a snakebite at its default location. While the rest of his team is overwhelming mid behind a rolling thunder, Wedid quietly sets up and pops his poison orb to block off the B heaven angle, and then lurks into B main. He doesn't check for Sabrosa, but luckily has Abram bail him out. This round is actually huge because it's the first time the Poison Orb has really been fundamental in an execute. It blocked off Sub Rosa from being able to catch a player or two crossing from heaven, and it enabled XSET to path around the orb and move onto rafters into sight. In round number 12, yeah, just forget about what I said about that screen towards A being the new normal. He goes back to setting up his screen towards B and then once again uses that snakebite at its default location. Once his teammates make their way from mid into B heaven, taking a casualty along the way, Wedid revs up the screen to try to make the task of taking full control of B heaven a little less daunting for the two remaining mid players. From here, Wedid tries playing contact off of Aaron's turret at B main, but loses the fight to Sub Rosa. The round ends pretty shortly thereafter. In round number 13, we swap paths, and you get to see how this Viper fares on defense. The setup here is 4A, 1B, with Aaron being the poor guy having to hold half the map by his lonesome. The goal in this round is simple: flash and get as much info at A as possible. When the immediate coast is clear, BCJ gets out of dodge. Later, as Wedid is practically in the enemy spawn, PR bails as well. It's actually a little bit absurd how fearless Wedid is here, but he walks all the way through T-spawn, and then we end up with a pretty ridiculous set of positions by the time the minute mark hits. Eventually, Thwifo, Wedid's comrade in arms, walks all the way through sewer into mid and takes down Drone from behind. Wedid gets his just desserts as he completes the arduous walk through enemy spawn, and then blindsides Cutler at B main. Round ends shortly thereafter, with XSET winning almost every single fight. In round number 14, Wedid starts with setting up a one-way Poison Orb at A heaven and a snakebite towards A main. Seeing the one-way on the radar is basically impossible, so here's a handy little guide to show you what it looks like. After being pressured by a Trailblazer and getting info on mid being compromised, he uses another snakebite to stop a ropes push for a few seconds, and then backs off and plays towards spawn. It's also important to note here that he runs out of gas, so he turns off the one-way smoke as he falls back to CT, and then pops it again once he gets a noise cue from Aaron's turret shooting Wardell. The rest of this round is nothing special or unique to Viper. Wedid rotates when there's action on the other side of the map, and then jump peeks for info in a 4 vs 1. In round 15, it's a one-way Poison Orb and the A main snakebite once again. After a careful peek from heaven, Wedid follows and activates the one-way. TSM don't really path to kill Wedid here, not unexpected considering their buy, and Wedid is able to dance around and find one kill before tossing a snakebite that lands just a bit off of where Drone planted. Otherwise, Wedid just tries to be available to trade. In round 16, it's the same util set from last round, that Poison Orb and snakebite. He starts out playing a solo this round, as BCJ has gone to help out the other side. After a 6-set play from XSET goes right though, BCJ comes back. Wedid, for basically this entire round, just spots both A main and ropes periodically for info, and then rotates when it's a 5 vs 2. In round number 17, it's a usual utility set. When Wedid hears Wardell dash towards A heaven, he pops a one-way and plays from rafters. This is safe to do thanks to a bit of security from BCJ's one-way that covers him from players at A main. Wardell eventually sinks away though, and Wedid goes back to his scheduled peeking towards main and ropes. Presumably after hearing noise, or maybe a call, from ropes, he uses another snakebite towards it, pops his orb, and falls back to rafters. This right here indicates that XSET are expecting a mid-A split. That call, however, would be false, and TSM instead execute B and win basically every single fight. Stuck on rotator duty in the 2 vs 4, Wedid moves to B heaven and sets up a screen that 1. Makes it drop the hell a bit safer, and 2. Kind of divides B main in sight. A bit lucky here not to die to the stinger from Wardell, but still only at 2 HP, he walk pushes as close as he can behind his screen towards B main, while BCJ just honestly unleashes and finds a couple of kills. Wedid's life comes to an end, however, as he puts down the screen and Hazed finishes him off. In round number 18, it's a usual utility again, but a counter smoke from TSM on the cross leads Wedid to starting up his orb early, since he's scared of a push towards ramps. When a Trailblazer comes up and he realizes that it's probably clear though, he drops the orb to try to retain gas. He rotates to B a bit preemptively, probably because of some info that he got relayed, and gets a bit caught off guard as TSM have moved towards A, now completely deserted. TSM, having successfully sold a fake, take the A site and move into really strong post-plant positions with the help of Cutler's Seekers, and Wedid can't really do much, because TSM neglected taking A heaven control, where that one-way orb might be a bit useful. From here, Wedid dies trying to find a kill. In round number 19, Wedid only tosses the one-way Poison Orb, but not the snakebite. Instead, he moves past the one-way after popping it to fake a sound cue and holds ramps instead. It's also worth noting that BCJ is playing close to A main as well, so XSET are looking for a mix-up here. It doesn't really amount to anything though, and the two fall back. Wedid here actually moves towards ramps and peeks it safely a few times, afterwards setting up a screen to help out Thwifo a bit towards heaven, as well as possibly funnel TSM into a rope split. From here on out, Wedid really doesn't have to do too much, because the rest of XSET completely shut down the push from TSM. While this screen did make TSM hesitate a little bit, I don't think it necessarily changed up the round, since TSM after the fact just kind of lost all their fights, and the wall wasn't exactly a part of the equation. In round 20, XSET try this A-site mix-up seen in the last round again, complete with sound cue and all. Not finding any early results, they bail on the idea, and Wedid falls to A-heaven again, tossing the screen seen in the last round and peeking ropes every now and then. This time, Drone is there, and Wedid loses the fight. XSET win this round, but since this video is specifically a focus on Wedid and his Viper's impact on each round, let's go ahead and skip forward. In round 21, it's a new look, but structurally the same mix-up from XSET. They don't have a sound cue bait this time, but a double peek from Wedid and BCJ at ramps, with a flash from Thwifo to help, is able to immediately tag out Wardell. With a massive 5 vs 4 advantage, Wedid falls to hold ropes, this time a ton more aggressively, eventually pushing up towards mid as A1 grabs another. If nothing else, this is some strong info from XSET. Some absolutely wild timing from Cutler, though, leads to the two basically pathing the exact same area just seconds apart. Oh yeah, and he gets a knife onto Cutler.
He wasn't ready!
Round 22 sees a bit of an interesting play from XSET, as Wedid initially sets up his usual poison orb, but instead moves towards ropes. A flash from Thwifo at mid to start the round, and a couple of courtesy peeks from Wedid, but nothing is found. TSM almost immediately execute B, so Wedid responds by tossing out a neat screen to block B main, as well as snake bites to block the plant. This, combined with Aaron's lockdown, is actually massive, and TSM basically have to push to kill the ult, but will likely die trying. Although Wedid dies early on in this gunfight, his impact on Viper was huge. And quite honestly, this round is something that likely only Viper can do. Blocking B main is simple enough, but the double snake bites is absolutely extraordinary pressure. Now on to round 23, Wedid sets down the one-way and rotates towards A main. When the round begins, he tosses his usual snake bite, pushes towards the ultimate orb with the help of BCJ's paranoia to clear the area, and pops his Viper's Pit. This is something that you see Andbox's Poach use quite often, and it allows BCJ to move towards ropes and act as a rotator. TSM don't bother at all trying to take Wedid down, and instead quickly execute a B split behind Cutler's Seekers. On his way rotating from A, Wedid sets up an on-the-fly screen to block off the B heaven angle from mid. It's kind of a rough spot for Wedid though, and despite turning the screen on and off in attempts to isolate heaven angles, doesn't really accomplish much, since TSM are holding on site. In round 24, it's one-way orb as usual, but otherwise a pretty unique setup from XSET. BCJ has moved on to holding B, and PR has rotated to help out instead. Wedid has pushed past his orb, as seen in the previous rounds, and looks to toss a snakebite out when sound cues are made. The first one is used presumably towards bottom ramps on no discernible sound cue, and Thwifo's Rolling Thunder is used when the Trailblazer is popped from Cutler. On this mark, PR smokes A main and Wedid uses his other snakebite at the same time to discourage TSM from executing. It does its job pretty well, and TSM instead pull another B split. With a screen down that divides default plant from the back of pillar, Wedid is able to sit rafters and comfortably grab the remaining kills of the round, bringing it to overtime.
To fail right now, but Sub Rosa goes down. Now he's the last one alive, 70 HP, overtime secured.
Now back on attack in the first round of overtime, XSET are setting up for a burst onto A. Wedid doesn't use his screen until the round actually begins, at which point he sets down the usual A screen to block off the A heaven and ramps area and pops it. This is the cue for XSET's execute to begin, and with a couple of flashes from Thwifo, they're well on their way. Once set up, Wedid moves to the site and is actually in charge of planting the spike in order to get a point closer to Viper's Pit. On his way to default plant, he snakebite heaven to discourage peeks. After planting, he uses a poison orb to block elbow and another snakebite into screens. In round 26, it's defense again, and a similar look from Wedid. The typical one-way and a return to the snakebite towards A main, otherwise it's scheduled peeks onto A main and ropes. BCJ, after using both of his smokes to one-way, feels comfortable rotating to spawn. It's pretty fortunate positioning from these two, because Wedid spots and takes down Drone at ropes on one of his scheduled checks, and then snake bites himself off so he can safely back to rafters. BCJ is already in a perfect position to crossfire, and he comes from spawn to heaven and smacks down Sabrosa. Wedid isn't necessarily crossfiring anymore though, as he's gone to hold A main from rafters off of a sound cue from Cutler, which nets him another kill. Wedid then falls to hell and attempts to stay alive in the 3 versus 2 and maintain numbers. Out of seemingly nowhere, Hayes gets a massive 2k and reses Sabrosa and actually puts this round back in TSM's favor. He also sprints to the other side of the map with 17 seconds left on the clock to get the spike down. Now, Wedid knows the resurrected player was in A heaven, and he's only heard one pair of footsteps running. With this info in mind, he paths from ropes through mid and onto B heaven. Eventually, he hears a second pair of footsteps and has an idea of where Sabrosa is positioned. Seeing Spike planted for B main, Wedid kind of has to gamble that these positions aren't fakes, and he uses his screen to isolate both heaven and spawn angles from B main. He wins the gunfight against Hayes, which puts him onto Viper's Pit, which he pops and then taps a spike. Despite some pretty sick utility utilization in that round, it's not good enough to stop the blind spray from Sabrosa, and TSM are able to inch out the round. Now into double overtime, Wedid sets up his screen at A pre-round to block off the typical angles. Interestingly enough, TSM actually keep Wardell in spawn until they see where the screen is located, and then rotate him accordingly. Wedid starts up his screen when the round starts, and at the same time, Thwyfo is tossing a flash and making some noise at B main. Shortly after toggling the screen on, Wedid turns it right back off in order to try to sell this fake. This kind of throws confusion into TSM's heads, and their rotations become a bit out of whack. In the midst of this chaos, Drone is actually rotated over to B. A couple of seconds later, on the minute 20 mark, Wedid once again turns his screen on and XSET begin their execute. Wedid stays behind to line up an orb that lands over towards screens, and he otherwise patrols ramps, eventually moving up to A heaven once a coast is clear. Although he takes a gunfight in a 2 versus 1 and loses, he's traded out by Thwyfo, and XSET win the round. In the next round, XSET try their 3 mid setup again, and Wedid is stuck kind of having to gamble because of a few things that go down. 1. A Trailblazer paths towards A heaven. 2. BCJ is killed on A site. And 3. Thwyfo hears a ton of noise by mid. Now, this is a bit of a rough situation to be in and requires some solid game sense. He chooses to trust the info relayed by his teammates and instead moves towards ropes, despite losing a player at A just seconds before. It takes a little while for this position to come to fruition, but eventually it pays off, and Wedid is able to snag a kill onto the lurking player from mid. Quickly running to take B heaven control, he tosses a snakebite onto the default plant position first, and then a screen to divide default from pillar. This is actually massive, as it allows Aaron to hold close. And with that, XSET officially complete the comeback and are able to knock out TSM.
Situation, Aaron hits the shot at Sabrosa, who was not looking through the corner, and XSET completes the upset.